show his guilt. He had a hammer in his hand as he was chasing his girlfriend, who was screaming for help and covered in blood, and then he hid from the police. Members of the jury, these are the actions of a guilty man. And though there may be testimony denying these allegations, remember that words may lie, and actions speak louder than words. Good afternoon, my name is Stephen Luckie, and I, along with my co-counsel, Monica Bracey, represent the people of the state of Lone Star. We've charged the defendant with assault and domestic violence for attacking his girlfriend with a deadly weapon. Today, you'll learn just how that assault took place. On June 14, 2014, the defendant's girlfriend, Adriana Testa, was at home when the defendant wanted to hang a painting. Adriana went to help him hang this painting, but when she just lightly dropped it, the defendant lost control. We expect the evidence to show that he reached into his toolbox and pulled out a hammer and struck Adriana in the head with that hammer, causing blood to pour down her back. Adriana was scared and confused. She ran from the trailer, screaming for someone, anyone, to help her. The defendant, with that hammer still in his hand, chased off after Adriana. As they ran down the street and rounded the corner, we expect the evidence to show that the defendant again caught up to Adriana and again struck her in the head, causing her to fall to the ground. Luckily, a neighbor heard these cries for help and called the police. But what did the defendant do? He ran and hid. Adriana was rushed to the hospital where she was treated for her injuries, where a doctor saw the damage that was done to her. Members of the jury, we've charged the defendant with first-degree assault and criminal domestic violence for this attack. And we have to prove all of our elements beyond a reasonable doubt. In order to prove assault, we must prove that the defendant acted with the intent to cause serious bodily injury, that he actually did cause that serious bodily injury, and that he did so through the use of a deadly weapon. And finally, because the defendant and Miss Adriana Testa are in an intimate relationship, these actions constitute criminal domestic violence. Members of the jury, we expect the evidence to show that when the defendant acted on June 14, 2014, his actions showed that his only intent was to cause Adriana Testa's injuries. We expect you to see this beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean beyond any doubt. It doesn't mean beyond a shadow of a doubt. A reasonable doubt is not a speculative doubt. It's not an imaginary or a forced doubt. It's a doubt that is truly founded in reason. And at the end of today's case, we expect you to see that the only reasonable explanation for what happened, that the defendant intended to cause Adriana's injuries. In order to prove our case today, we'll be calling on two witnesses. First, we'll be calling on the victim herself, Miss Adriana Testa. We expect her testimony to reveal why the defendant had a hammer in his hand on June 14th. We expect her testimony to reveal why the defendant still had that hammer in his hand as he was chasing Adriana down the street. We expect Adriana to testify that the defendant struck her in the head with that hammer. Next, we'll be calling on Dr. Derek Shepard, the doctor that observed Adriana on the night of June 14th, 2014. We expect his testimony to reveal that Adriana's injuries were consistent with being struck with a hammer. We expect the doctor's testimony to reveal that Adriana's story of what happened matched her injuries. After we've called our witnesses, the defense will have their own opportunity to call witnesses. And if they do, keep just two questions in mind. What actions can they not deny? And what do these actions say about the truth of the defendant. After you've asked yourself these questions and reviewed the evidence, we expect you to come to a conclusion. Recall that the defendant had a hammer in his hand as he was chasing his girlfriend, who was screaming for help and covered in blood, and then he hid from the police. Members of the jury, these actions only support one conclusion. And at the end of today's case, my co-counsel will come before you and ask you to return a verdict. The only verdict that the evidence supports. Find the defendant guilty.
Yes, ma'am.
Members of the jury, you just heard from the state in their opening statement, in which they told you a story of assault and domestic violence. But by the end of today's trial, you will see that the state's story is based on nothing more than he said, she said. By the end of the trial, you will see that the state has failed to meet their burden of proof, because he said, she said is not enough. I am Leanna McMiniman, and I, along with my co-counsel, Alexa Kleska, represent the defendant, Peter Seeger. And while we're here today, we're going to present you with testimony and evidence that shows the real story of what happened on June 14, 2014, the story of an innocent man. See, the state would have you believe that last June, Peter Seeger harmed his then-girlfriend, Adriana Testa. They would have you believe that there is undisputed testimony and evidence to support these accusations. But in all actuality, their story of he said, she said is based on nothing more than a fabricated story and insufficient evidence. The state will present you with nothing more today than he said, she said. We, however, we will present you with the truth and the facts, the evidence that shows Peter Seeger is guilty of nothing more than falling in love with Adriana Testa. Now, you'll hear from several witnesses today. You'll hear from the alleged victim, Adriana Testa. She'll take the stand, and we expect that she'll say how Peter Seeger harmed her last June, how he hit her in the head with a hammer. But we also expect she'll take the stand and say that after she was attacked, she had the ability to get up, run away, out into the streets and all through the neighborhood, despite her injuries and her intoxicated state. So while you listen to Ms. Testa's testimony, while you listen to all of the testimony today, we ask that you keep a few questions in mind. Ask yourself, can this testimony be trusted? Does the evidence support that testimony? And what stake do the parties have in the case today? Keep those three questions in mind, particularly as you listen to the testimony of Dr. Derek Shepard. We expect Dr. Shepard to take the stand today and tell you how he saw Adriana Testa in the emergency room that night, how he treated her. We expect he'll tell you that her injuries were more serious than they actually were. But we also expect Dr. Shepard will come before you and review Ms. Testa's medical records from that very night. Her medical records including a tox screen and CT scan. That tox screen will show Ms. Testa had consumed Xanax and alcohol, further showing her intoxicated state. The CT scan will show that Ms. Testa did not suffer any serious head wounds that night. Not a fracture, not a concussion, not a lesion. See, the state's story won't add up today. What he, Dr. Shepard, tells you can be scientifically refuted, and what she, Adriana Testa, tells you won't add up. The state's case won't make sense, and they won't meet their burden of proof, because he said, she said is not enough. Now, the state and their two witnesses, they're not the only two people you'll hear from today. You will also hear from Peter Seeger. He'll take the stand, and he'll tell you his side of the story. But keep in mind, Mr. Seeger does not have to take this stand today. He has a right to remain silent, a right not to testify, but he will. Because Mr. Seeger feels it's important that you hear from him what happened on the night of June 14th, 2014. So he will. He'll take that stand and testify today that that night really began like any other. He was just trying to hang a painting while Adriana got ready for work, which he will explain means Adriana had already had one too many Red Bull and vodkas. Then he'll tell you how Adriana, in her intoxicated state, freaked out, started yelling and screaming, "I'll call the cops and tell them you hit me if you keep hanging that painting," even though Peter Seeger didn't harm her at all. And the evidence will further show that despite her cries for help, no one harmed Adriana Testa. No one touched her. No one hit her. And then Mr. Seeger will tell you, keeping in mind the Red Bull and vodka Ms. Testa had drank that night, how Ms. Testa ran out into the streets, all through the neighborhood, stumbling, falling, injuring her hands, her knees, and even her head. And then Mr. Seeger will finally tell you how the police arrived that night. He'll tell you how he came out, spoke with them openly, allowed them to search his home, because Peter Seeger had nothing to hide. And finally, members of the jury, you will hear from Jordan Kravitz, the only eyewitness to the events that happened last June, the only person here to testify about what happened other than Peter Seeger and Adriana Testa. Ms. Kravitz, she will take the stand today, and she will tell you what she heard and what she saw, as she is the only eyewitness. She'll tell you how she heard Adriana's cries for help, screaming, "Stop hitting me, call the police." But Ms. Kravitz, she'll tell you that what she heard and what she saw didn't add up. She heard those cries, so she walked up to her front door, looked out into the street, and what did she see? Nothing more than Peter Seeger following behind Adriana Testa, never catching up to her, never touching her, never harming her in any way. Peter Seeger is an innocent man, and by the end of today's trial, when you've reviewed all the testimony and all the evidence, you will see just that. You will see that the state has failed to meet their burden of proof, their burden of beyond a reasonable doubt, because he said, she said is not enough. And at the end of the trial today, my co-counsel, Ms. Kleska, she will come before you in this very spot and ask that you do the only thing that evidence and justice allows. Find Peter Seeger not